So what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that, but I don't know. I'm amazed at my own belief, and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. Yeah. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ.
Why, hello my fellow apes, I hope you're well. What you've just seen is a segment from a conversation between Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot that aired earlier this month. Since then, various Christian outlets have provided commentary, with the primary sentiment being that we're witnessing the Christian God work in real time on Jordan. Now, I doubt you'll be surprised to hear that I, being non-religious, have a different perspective, but what might surprise you is that I'm nevertheless touched by Jordan's tears. Despite Jungian synchronicity being an unfalsifiable pseudoscience, I can somewhat understand why Jordan invokes it. Given this, I think I have a perspective that at least some of you might appreciate, and in any case, I'm sure I can provide food for thought. However, before we get to my views, I think it's important that we take a brief look at some Christian perspectives.
So Peterson rightly recognizes the significance of what it means for the story of Christ to not just be some pragmatic story to help people live better lives or to become more fulfilled or something like that, which it does, but instead it changes everything about the world that we once knew, and it unifies the intangible world with the tangible, objective world. Now, with that being said, it seems as if God is working in Peterson's life. So make sure you guys all keep him in prayer and pray for him to come to an objective truth about who God really is and what that means for his life.
It seems like Dr. Peterson is really kind of considering this, even to the point that he says, and I probably believe it. So that's a wonderful and really encouraging thing to hear from him here. So what I'm trying to say here is that Dr. Peterson correctly ties in the transformation of life to faith itself, in that it is in fact faith, it is trust that is the root out of which our lives flow, out of which we live lives that are transformed by the presence of Christ within us.
And so I'd read 1 Corinthians 1, 2, and 3 and say, Jordan, I think you're being described here. Then how would I help Jordan? I think that I'd like to press on his conscience. The reality is, Jordan, those ideals that you think are so wonderful, you have failed. You have fallen short. And the reason that you are looking for some sort of ethereal narrative is because you have a sense of justice and you have fallen short. And you need this Jesus. And the great news is he did exist. And he will save you if you will set aside all of the highfalutin thinking, become like a child, repent, and put your trust in Jesus Christ.
Alright, so there's just a few of the most popular Christian sentiments. Some, if not most, are convinced that we're witnessing Jordan carry his cross before attaining salvation, or at the very least the Christian God is guiding his path. If you're interested in hearing the views of those I've just played in full, I've left links below. But now I'm going to give you my own thoughts as we listen to the entire segment.
And then I think, I have been dealing with these, borderline religious issues. Well, certainly not just borderline. There's lots of religious people who seem to think that I'm dealing with religious issues. And that's really what I wanted to talk to you about tonight. So this book I mentioned earlier talked about disagreements with my conceptualization of Christ, let's say, and I'm not sure what that conceptualization is, by the way, exactly. It's a mystery to me. But I can say some concrete things about it. I mean, I understand and appreciate the symbolic significance of the ideal human being. And that finds its embodiment. And I took these ideas in large part from Jung and Erich Neumann, that Christ is at least a representation of the ideal man.
As a quick side note, know that I have a few things to say here, but I'll save them for a little later since they're somewhat peripheral.
Whatever that is. And we all, interestingly enough, we all seem to have an ideal. and that ideal has us, right? And that's where it's very interesting to consider the role of conscience, because your conscience will call you out on your behavior. And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent, or at least as something that you can't fully voluntarily control. Because if you could voluntarily control it, then you just tell the pesky little bastard to go away, or to pat you on the back continually, because there must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist.
Okay, so Jordan is of course correct when he says that we have an ideal, a moral foundation, if you will, that seems somewhat independent, or at the very least to be something we can't entirely control. I would personally maintain that this is true of all facets of the subconscious, but acknowledge that it's most prominent in the case of moral intuition, the conscience, for reasons I'll get to in just a moment. I don't know about you, but when my subconscious reminds me to, say, pick up bread on the way home, I feel almost compelled to thank it. And even now I'm personifying it as something external. What's more, I've noticed a very suspicious correlation, in which the less people understand the subconscious act, the more they imbue it with autonomy. The other night, for instance, I was driving home when all of a sudden my subconscious told me to slow down, and seemingly for no reason. The road was clear, the weather was fine, and nobody was in sight. Yet a few moments later, I drove slowly through oil, which is obviously very dangerous, and especially on a motorbike. After reflecting, I'm now fairly certain that I subconsciously noticed a car much further ahead slow down at the oil, but honestly, I still don't know what informed my subconscious. If I was a religious man, however, I might be certain. It was good karma for my giving blood last week, or it's my dead dad looking down on me, or it's God guiding my path. Now, the subconscious part of us that is our conscience, our sense of right and wrong, is of course significantly more mysterious than the example I just gave, since it pertains to our deep-rooted evolution as opposed to our surface-level interactions. Or in other words, we can make some sense of the subconscious telling us to slow down because we can reason that we made a subconscious inference. But when it comes to our conscience telling us not to still, we're seemingly at a loss to understand why. And so when it calls us out,
your conscience will call you out.
It does indeed carry the illusion of being somewhat independent.
And so it seems to function as something that's somewhat independent.
Because of this, I can easily understand why one might categorize the conscience as something that's independently within us as a foundation, and/or as something that's beyond us, as if it's woven into the cosmos itself. I'd even go so far as to say that I experience these illusions of transcendence regularly. The slightest touch of scrutiny, however, shatters them. Putting the logical considerations aside, I'd maintain that even a rudimentary understanding of our evolution as a social species entirely accounts for our conscience. What's more, the evolutionary account makes far better sense of the fact that we all experience a slightly different ideal to one another. It easily explains why, for instance, the Bible not only explicitly endorses slavery, but specifically instructs us on how to treat them. It's strange, right, that with this ideal Jesus figure, slaves were reminded to obey their masters with fear, when he or any of his apostles could have so easily have said, "Thou shalt not own another human under any circumstance." Well, no, it's not that strange at all on a biological account. Now, I've put quite a bit on the table here, but I'll forego responding to a few of the following things, as much of what I've just said applies.
There must be few things in life more pleasurable than being a fully committed narcissist. To really believe that everything that you do is right and that you're a good person. And I suppose if you could wave a magic wand and rearrange your mind so that it was constantly telling you that, you'd do it. But you don't seem to be able to do that in relationship to your conscience. It trips you up. And so it tells you when you're not living up to your own ideal. And that means that you have an ideal and you don't even know what the hell it is, but you certainly know when you transgress against it. And I know that there's a strong line of Christian thinking that's identified the conscience with divinity, sometimes with Christ inside, sometimes with the Holy Spirit. And those are very interesting conceptualizations.
Christians have, no doubt, identified the conscience with divinity, but so too has pretty much every religion, albeit in various degrees. Moral intuition is quite frankly the best argument from emotion at religion's disposal, being employed as evidence of divine command by followers of Abrahamic religions, and employed as evidence of samsara by followers of Indian religions. So, I agree with Jordan here, but as is often the case when he pays special attention to Christianity, I think the same is true more than less of other faiths.
Those are very interesting conceptualizations, but you can think of them psychologically, and you can even think about them biologically, to some degree, because we're so social. If we don't manifest an appropriate moral reciprocity, we're going to become alienated from our fellows, and we won't survive, and we'll suffer and die, and we certainly won't find a partner and have children successfully. And so to some degree, the conscience can be viewed as the voice of reciprocal society within, and that's a perfectly reasonable biological explanation. But the thing is the deeper you go into biology, the more it shades into something that appears to be religious, because you start analyzing the fundamental structure of the psyche itself.
Yeah, I think that's fair. The deeper we go into biology, the more mysterious it is. But to borrow a few words from John Adams' diary, mystery is made a convenient cover for absurdity. If religions are united in one thing, it's that they smuggle that which they revere the most into that which we don't understand. The more mysterious the phenomena, the more cozy the bed. When Ptolemy was codifying his geocentric model of the universe, he wrote in the margins what is, I must say, the most beautiful God of the Gaps I've ever read. When I trace at my pleasure the windings to and fro the heavenly bodies, I no longer touch the earth with my feet. I stand in the presence of Zeus himself and take my fill of ambrosia. In Ptolemy's time, the entire night sky was a mystery, and so that's where he placed the divine. This God of the Gaps trend didn't, of course, start with him, and honestly, I doubt it will ever end. Newton invoked God when he confronted the mystery of the stability of the solar system, and Huygens, to give just one more example, invoked God at the mystery of biology. For, as he put it, the finger of God and the wisdom of divine providence is in them. But where among the fruits of the Enlightenment that we all bask within today is there left for the divine to take refuge? Well, of course, where it's always hid, in the mystery that is beyond our knowledge. Despite the extraordinary advancements we've made, the details of our conscience remain an enigma. Couple this with the fact that we experience our conscience as if it's somewhat independent, and we have a 5-star restaurant for the God of the Gaps to dine.
Analyzing the fundamental structure of the psyche itself, and it becomes something, well, it becomes something with a power that transcends your ability to resist it. So you can think about Christ from a psychological perspective, and my critic, this particular critic that I've been reading, said, well, that doesn't differentiate Christ much from a whole sequence of dying and resurrecting mythological gods. And of course, people have made that claim in comparative religion. Joseph Campbell did that, and Jung to a lesser degree, I would say, but Campbell did that. But the difference, and C.S. Lewis pointed this out as well, the difference between those mythological gods and Christ was that there's a representation of, there's a historical representation of his existence as well. Now, you can debate whether or not that's genuine. You can debate about whether or not he actually lived and whether there's credible objective evidence for that, but it doesn't matter in some sense because it does, but there's a sense in which it doesn't matter because there's still a historical story. And so what you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived plus a myth. And in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that.
Given Jordan's tendency to conjure vastly different definitions to everyone else, such as how he defines atheists as essentially murderers, the statement, I probably believe that, strikes me as pretty much impossible to unpack without having him in the room, and so I'll sidestep it here. The bigger problem, so far as I see it, is that someone can easily emulate what Jordan does with Jesus with many other religious figures. To take one example, there's strong evidence that Muhammad actually lived and actually did some of the things written in the Quran, and likewise there's many myths attached to him. And so Jordan could just as easily say that Muhammad is the union of myth and history.
An actual person who actually lived plus a myth.
And then proceed to speak of how the quasi-independence of the conscience supports the ideal of Muhammad. But, of course, Muhammad never claimed to be God himself, and Islamic mythology doesn't have him resurrect, and so I guess, technically, he doesn't fit Jordan's narrow criteria of what constitutes the ideal. But that's the thing, Jordan has designed the shoe to fit the foot.
What you have in the figure of Christ is an actual person who actually lived, plus a myth, and in some sense, Christ is the union of those two things. The problem is I probably believe that. But I don't
Okay.
know. I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world.
And this brings us to the climax, the moment that's garnered so much attention. And you know what? I really hear what Jordan's saying, as I possess a very similar narrative. For me, the story is told by our sovereign masters of suffering and pleasure, and the conscience is the social species within us possessing us just as we possess it. It's our operating system, if you will, and try as we might to install certain software to rationalize certain selfish actions, we're going to have problems if it isn't compatible with our operating system. That is, we're going to fail to live up to our ideal. It is going to tell us to clean our room and treat our kin with dignity and respect. Now, of course, it doesn't literally transcend us, and it doesn't exist without us, but to borrow a phrase from Jordan, we act as if it transcends us because we don't have a choice. In this regard, it's similar to the illusion of free will. Before proceeding, I want to quickly backtrack to the key moment that's touched people, if only to give it rightful emphasis.
I'm amazed at my own belief and I don't understand it. Like, because I've seen sometimes the objective world and the narrative world touch. That's Jungian synchronicity. And I've seen that many times in my own life. And so in some sense, I believe it's undeniable. We have a narrative sense of the world. For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act. It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world.
Honestly, I just don't see how I can possibly object to what's being said here without coming across as offensive, because behind the pseudoscience of Jungian synchronicity and the mysterious religious language, we're looking at a man who's recently suffered a litany of unfortunate events and yet is still trying his best, and so I just don't feel comfortable calling out the issues. It's obvious that Jordan gets something out of Christian mythology, and that's great for him. It's none of my business. Or, put another way, there's a time and a place to call out the pseudoscience fallacies and dissonance, and this bucko simply ain't it. But, on the other hand, the act of making bad ideas more palatable is extremely harmful, as it emboldens those that take the Bible a little more literally. And so my conscience is quite frankly staggered. It doesn't know what to do, and so I've lost my compass. Do I explain what Jungian synchronicity is and precisely why it's pseudoscience? Do I give examples of how, say, New Age movements use it with tarot cards? Or do I address this obliquely by saying, hey, the Christian God might be working through Jordan, but then again, he might be working through me to call out Jordan's extremely metaphorical interpretation? I don't know, but perhaps I've said enough already.
It's real. Like, we treat it like it's real. It's not the objective world. But the narrative and the objective world touch. And the ultimate example of that, in principle, is supposed to be Christ. But I don't know what to... that seems to me oddly plausible.
Yeah.
But I still don't know what to make of it. It's too... partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
I think that you'd become in essence a member of the Westboro Baptist Church, and I'm dead serious. The people that fully believe that the Bible is true, the people who don't feel the need to mould it in any way to something compatible with modern science and socio-economic circumstances, tend to be seen ironically as the devil. The God of the Bible is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction, and so I find it no coincidence that those that fully and truly believe the fiction reflect his malevolence. As Matt Dillahunty puts it, beliefs inform actions and actions have consequences, and the consequences of Christian belief are dire. From the grotesque mistreatment of women and homosexuals to the infinitely immoral concept of hell to the barbaric notion of inheriting sin. Given this, I'm personally glad to see Jordan maintain his form and avoid the Kool-Aid. As much as I find his New Age Christianity frustratingly vacuous and enabling, I think that the shift in Christian thought that he's been at the forefront of is an absolute win. Despite Christians asserting that they're experiencing a resurgence, this archetypical Christianity is truly a different beast, and with far less teeth. It's no secret that when religions and other ideologies lose favour, they rarely die. Rather, they reassemble themselves into something similar, but claim the same heritage. You know, how Christians claim the historicity of 2,000 years, and yet conveniently ignore the fact that for over 90% of those years, Christians enforced slavery with explicit reference to the Bible. And on this note, I've always found it somewhat perplexing that Jordan's narrative is morality.
For me, that's been the world of morality. That's the world that tells us how to act.
And yet he so strongly favours Christianity, a religion that's morally bankrupt. But if Jordan does actually drink the Kool-Aid and come to literally believe that a man called Jesus was God incarnate, that he was born of a virgin, that he resurrected, that he cured lepers, multiplied loaves and fishes, walked on water, calmed storms and cursed a fig tree, then whilst I'd be a little disappointed to see a keen mind fall to nonsense, I genuinely wish him well. In any case, I sincerely hope that he finds the small measure of peace that he's been seeking. With that, I'm going to leave you with the tail end of the segment I've been commenting on. But before doing so, I just want to sign off by saying thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons, who just about single-handedly enable me to lend my voice to important topics such as this. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Thank you.
Partly because it's too terrifying a reality to fully believe. I don't even know what would happen to you if you fully believed it.
If you believed in the story of Christ, or if you believed that history and let's say the narrative meet, let's
both,
say.
I think you, because when you believe that, you buy both those stories. You believe that the narrative and the objective can actually touch.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw that, you and I mean, this is a trivial example, but we had when we were discussing, we had a sequence of discussions around frog symbolism 4 years ago.
Yeah.
That was very bizarre, to say the least. You know, and that was a trivial example, relatively trivial example of the narrative world and the objective world coming together.